Hello everyone, I am Uriah Heep, and welcome to my literary cafe. Tonight we present the Great American Novel series by the Author's Matrix. And today's novel, which we've been reading for a while now, is called The Village Idiot by Dan Blanchfield. In chapter 14, it seems that Nigel has crossed the Rubicon. He's seen the light about water. But in chapter 15, looks like Professor Umph has something in store for him. Let's find out.
Chapter 15. The morning finally came, and Nigel had barely slept. The tossing and turning, trying to rid himself of the smell of raw sewage, was more than he could take, and he arose that morning exhausted. He dressed quietly and made his way to the kitchen. Usually his mum would prepare the family breakfast, but Nigel could not fathom eating raw sewage-drenched porridge again. At this point, he realized for the first time that he knew too much. There would be no more going back now. He felt he could not drink sewage-laced water again, or eat food prepared with such toxic sludge. He determined that he would rise early every morning and prepare his meals with the pure water he had received from Addison each week when he attended his lectures. "I will need to carry as much water as I can," Nigel reasoned to himself. "I will need a sufficient supply to last me for the week." Nigel swiftly busied himself about the kitchen, preparing his porridge with the fresh, pure water in his jug. He found it reasonably easy to cook and was somewhat surprised at his culinary abilities. As the porridge was simmering on the stove, Nigel realized that he had never really smelled the actual porridge in all his days. It was delightful. The stench of raw sewage always permeated the actual natural odor of the porridge, he said to himself. "I have been smelling toxic sewage all these years. I have never actually enjoyed the sweet smell of porridge." This was a revelation for Nigel. As he took a healthy ladle of porridge and poured it into his bowl, he heard his parents stir in the other room. Appearing nonplussed, Nigel simply ate his porridge as his parents entered the kitchen. "What is that odor?" Edith said before greeting her son. "I smell it too," declared Jonah. "I cooked up some porridge," Nigel said between mouthfuls and avoiding eye contact with either parent. "That doesn't smell like porridge, Nigel," his mum declared. "What is that smell? What did you do to it?" Nigel remained focused on the bowl before him and did not look up as he said, "I just cooked it, Mum." Edith and Jonah looked at each other confused. There was no stench of raw sewage in the kitchen, yet a meal was just prepared. This made no logical sense to either of them. Edith walked over to the stove, took the top off the pot of simmering porridge, and peered inside. "This isn't porridge, Nigel," she declared. "I cannot smell any sewage in it." She glanced up at Nigel, expecting a response, but received none. "What did you cook this porridge with, son?" Nigel motioned with his head toward the jug of fresh, pure water he had received from Addison that sat on the counter and took another mouthful of porridge. Perplexed, Edith slowly walked over to the counter and took the jug in her hands. "What is this, Nigel?" she asked without opening it, almost as if she feared what she might find if she had. "That is water, Mum," Nigel replied as he continued his meal, avoiding unnecessary eye contact. Edith picked up the jug, took out the cork, and slowly sniffed its contents. "This jug is empty, Nigel," she declared. "I don't smell anything in it." There was no way to delay this unwanted conversation, but Nigel felt he had no choice. "That is water, Mum. You cannot smell it because it does not have any smell." Perplexed, Edith asked, "Then how is it water, Nigel?" "It is purified water, Mum," he replied. "There are no impurities in it. They have all been removed." At this point in the conversation, Edith was more confused than ever. Jonah, too, scrunched up his nose, took the jug from his wife, and sniffed its contents. "Your mum is correct, Nigel. There is no smell. It cannot be water without the smell of raw sewage. What do you have here?" Nigel was beginning to be frustrated at his parents' inability to grasp what he was telling them. It was so simple to him that the fact that his parents appeared wholly ignorant irked him. He got up from the table, leaving his half-eaten porridge, took up his father's jug, and grabbed a glass from the nearby cupboard. As he poured the water into the glass, his parents stared in wonder. The fluid that poured forth from the jug had no color or smell. It was like the glass was still empty. "Here, father," Nigel said matter-of-factly. "This is water." Nigel handed the glass of water to his father, sat back down at the breakfast table, and resumed his meal. His parents passed the glass back and forth between the two of them, examining its contents with looks of wonder and astonishment writ large across their faces. "Did you cook your porridge with this glass of nothing, Nigel?" his mum asked fearfully. "Indeed I did, mum," was the retort from her son. "Nigel, dear," his mum implored, "we are so fortunate to have a trench full of the freshest raw sewage in the village, flowing right across the street from our house. Why would you cook with this jug of nothing when you can enjoy all the raw sewage water God supplies?" At this point, Nigel felt that continuing this conversation along these lines was entirely pointless. He wished to end the conversation and leave for the university as briskly as possible without being unduly rude to his parents. "I would like to discuss this further, Mum, but I'm late for my first class. Perhaps we can resume this conversation tonight?" He had never been so satisfied with a meal in his young life as he was now, eating a bowl of simple porridge prepared with fresh, pure water. The desire to enjoy that meal was stronger than the desire to engage his parents further, so he swiftly bade them farewell, packed up his books, and went to the door. "Be good, Nigel," his mum said as he waved farewell. Once out of sight, Jonah and Edith stared at each other, trying to make sense of what had just occurred. Jonah held the jug of water in his hand and sniffed it once again. "This is nothing, Edith," he stated emphatically. "How can Nigel call this peculiar substance water when it is nothing of the sort? This must be the influence of that idiot in the Highlands." "Oh, Jonah," Edith replied. "Do you think Nigel went up to the Highlands again after what you had told him?" "Where else would he get this jug of nothing, Edith?" "Oh," Edith said, and nothing more. When Nigel arrived at the university, he thankfully avoided the cafeteria, as his stomach was full of the porridge he had eaten for breakfast. This was a relief for him, as he knew he would not experience the digestive issues he always had after consuming a meal cooked in sewage water. He strode into Professor Umph's classroom only to find it empty. There was a note on the blackboard directing all students to move to the lecture hall, which Nigel obeyed. The lecture hall was full of nearly 100 students, and 3 other professors were standing in the front of the room, engaged in serious discussion. As the students settled in their seats, Nigel too found a seat in the far back of the hall. It was clear that Professor Umph was in charge, as the other professor deferred to him to address the gathering. "Students," Professor Umph began solemnly, "the science department here at this magnificent institution of higher learning has arranged for a special guest lecturer for all our students to enjoy and learn from this morning." The students remained respectfully silent. "The scientific method," Professor Umph continued, "is the cornerstone of everything we do in our glorious field of study. We do not allow our opinions and biases to cloud our scientific judgment. No, not for a moment." The class stirred, and Nigel was perplexed. "Too often in our society," the professor continued, "humanity has been led astray by charlatans, hucksters and frauds perpetrating heinous misdeeds in the name of so-called science. But that will never be allowed at this great university." The students sat silent still, as the professor expected a burst of approval from the students at his exhortation. "So therefore, we have gathered our entire science department here this morning to hear our guest lecturer, Professor Harrington Glasgow, esteemed Professor Emeritus from the University of London, speak on a timely subject. Students, I give your Professor Glasgow. There was a polite smattering of applause as the corpulent elderly man with stringy white hair, purposely mussed up about the top of his head that he used to cover up a rather large sore, sat quietly in his chair. His ruddy face was swollen and desperately pale. He smiled, but the remaining teeth in his mouth struggled for prominence as the open sore on his bottom lip took precedence over any other notable feature on his face. In short, the gathered students witnessed a living corpse barely standing before them. The class remained in the dark as to precisely what this visiting professor might lecture about, and that curiosity was the only thing that managed to keep Nigel's attention. Professor Glasgow cleared his throat, spit some sputum on the lecture hall floor, and began his lecture. Students of this magnificent university here in the humble village of Crumbly, you all sitting before me have the rarest opportunities to study the world as it is, and not as some fanciful delusion of failed academics long ago. The students present remained in the dark as to the meaning of this lecture. Nigel, however, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Professor Glasgow continued, "My time is short, I must admit, so that I will sally forth into the meat of my lecture without further ado." Despite this assurance, the professor rambled on for 20 minutes without saying anything. He hopped from topic to topic, never staying on one for over a few moments. The university students were growing restless, and Professor Umph desperately needed an intervention to push his colleague on track. "Professor Glasgow," Professor Umph interjected, "if I may." Professor Glasgow turned and stared at Professor Umph, and could see the frustration in his eyes. "Oh yes, indeed," Professor Glasgow said with a smirk across his face. "I do tend to ramble. I will get right to it. Thank you, Professor Umph." The university students were fatigued now and noticeably bored. This was the last chance for Professor Glasgow to justify his visit as a guest lecturer, and he knew it. "I will tell you a story about this esteemed university from long ago. It will put your studies well into perspective, and I believe motivate every one of you to take with the utmost seriousness your study of the sciences." Professor Glasgow spent the next nearly hour recounting the story of a university student decades ago who disgraced this institution with his foolish study of the nature of water. Yes, Professor Glasgow told the gathered students, including Nigel Crumbly, all about Addison Way's attempt to besmirch this great university's reputation with the foolhardiest study known to humanity. He recalled hearing of this dark episode in London, where he was taking his doctoral studies. At first, he thought it was some sort of urban legend developing in real time. However, he soon learned that it was all true. It was the most tragic time for this learned institution, I can assure all of you. But the swift action this university took to eject that lunatic from it saved its reputation and helped make it among the most prestigious in the world. Nigel sat there stunned into a stony silence. As the rest of his classmates eagerly listened to the dramatic story recounted by the esteemed professor from London, Nigel found that he could not move a single muscle. "And in conclusion, my young university students and the future of mankind," Professor Glasgow said, emphasizing the word future, "I leave you all with these words of wisdom." He hesitated and seemed to brush away a lone tear forming underneath his right eye. "Always keep an open mind and keep asking questions until you are delighted with the answer. You are all budding scientists, so act like one." Nigel was breathless. The abject hypocrisy in Professor Glasgow's final words to the class was stunning. He had just implored his students to always go after truth and knowledge right after recounting a story about Addison Way, and how that learned institution had done precisely the opposite of what the professor had just implored all his students to do. There was no desire to know and understand Addison's monumental, groundbreaking study of the nature of water by the professors of his day. The professors showed themselves to be small-minded, narrow and arrogant when presented with new knowledge that had just come into the world. Can't they see their hypocrisy set right before their very noses? Nigel asked himself as the students filed out of the lecture hall. As he approached the exit, Professor Umph looked at his prized student and nodded approbation. My God, Nigel thought. Professor Umph arranged this lecture for my benefit. He could not look his professor in the eye, and instead turned his head askance and slid out of the hall past several students. Nigel was unable to attend his afternoon classes that day. The lecture by Professor Glasgow devastated him, and he felt he needed time to come to an understanding of the massive contradiction that was battling in his mind. He had come to see that what Addison Way had begun to teach him was true, yet the whole world refused to acknowledge it. How did that make sense? How could something be so true, yet remain dismissed by the people who should be studying this truth for themselves and taking the responsibility of telling the world about it? As he wandered about the main square of the village of Crumbly, he stopped to gaze up at the statue of his long-lost relative, Aldous Crumbly, who had founded this bucolic village so many centuries ago and now stood watch over it in the form of this bronze statue. How can I continue my education at the university? Nigel wondered aloud. After this massive insult to the life's work of Addison Way. He felt he would somehow agree with the extreme snobbishness evinced by his professors were he to continue his studies. How can I walk into a university lab and conduct worthless experiments that I know, in advance, will come to nothing and advance the study of science, not a whit? Nigel had no answer to the question he posed to himself. He decided to return to the Highlands and speak with Addison about what had just occurred at the university. The trek up the hill was exhausting, and Nigel found himself craving some of the fresh, pure water that awaited his arrival at Addison's lab. His knock went unanswered when he finally arrived at the cabin's front door. He went around the back to Addison's lab and resumed rapping on the large oak door. He heard a stirring from within, and moments later, Addison opened the door. He was dressed in his lab outfit, which made it evident to Nigel that an experiment was underway. Enter, my friend. Addison greeted Nigel warmly and led him inside. I am just finishing up an experiment, so find yourself a comfortable seat. I will be finished in just a few minutes, and then we can visit. You look dehydrated, Nigel, so please have some water. I just purified a batch over there. He pointed to a 50-gallon drum set up against the far wall, and Nigel wasted no time helping himself to as much water as he could until he was satisfied. As Nigel sat in the same seat he first sat in at Addison's lecture the other evening, he took a moment to gaze around the large room. The ceiling was high up, 2 full stories. The room itself felt expansive, unlike the classrooms at the university. There was a liberating sense of space and airiness all around him. Although the lab was full of scientific equipment and copious volumes of books everywhere, the room was not crowded. Nigel wondered how the entire building was chock full of so much, yet it had the feeling of openness and space. There now, Addison declared as he wrapped up his experiment. He took a moment to clear his lab table of the equipment, storing it neatly underneath, and sat next to Nigel. So, Nigel, what brings you to my lab today? Nigel shuffled his feet and looked away from Addison. He thought he was ready to have this conversation, but words failed him as his emotions overtook his entire being. Addison, sensitive as he was to the feelings of others, could see that his friend was quite upset and tried to settle him. Whatever is upsetting you, Nigel, Addison began, surely you can talk about it here. The kindness emanating from Addison was like the fresh, pure water Nigel just greedily drank from the drum. This bolstered his confidence just enough to enable him to begin the conversation. It is about the university, Addison, Nigel began timidly. Addison waited for Nigel to continue, but his words failed him again. Did something happen today, Nigel? Addison inquired. Yes, Addison, Nigel continued. The science department faculty gathered their entire student body, all of the students studying the various aspects of science at the university, in the lecture. I mean, the hall was packed full, standing room only. Nigel stopped. "And what was the purpose of the gathering, Nigel?" Addison asked. "Well," Nigel continued, "a guest speaker from the University of London came to our humble university. He gave a talk." It was evident to Addison that all this was difficult for Nigel to express, given the current state of his emotions. He did not speak or attempt to urge him on until Nigel was ready to continue. A few moments passed, and Nigel seemed to compose himself enough to resume recounting the lecture. "There was this professor, or shall I say, Professor Emeritus, from the university," Nigel continued, and he rambled on quite a bit. It was indeed a horrid sight, I must say. He was an older man, but one got the feeling that it was a living corpse speaking to the class. His appearance was wretched. Nigel spent the next hour giving every excruciating detail of Professor Glasgow's lecture. He did not hold back. His emotions sometimes overwhelmed him, and he had to stop. Addison remained silent throughout the entire time and did not interrupt Nigel. Finally, choked with emotion, Nigel said, "They were talking about you, Addison, and what a downright fool you were, and how you almost single-handedly ruined our university with your water research." Nigel sat back in his chair. He was spent, exhausted. He felt horrible telling his friend about this abuse hurled at him in front of the entire science department at the university. Nigel wept. He could no longer control his emotions. He had seen enough of the value of Addison's research to know that he was in the presence of greatness and could not stand to see his reputation besmirched by a so-called esteemed university professor. "The worst part was," he continued, "that I just sat there and said nothing." Nigel could not face his friend, nor look him in the eyes. He turned his head to the side and bit his lower lip, nearly to the point of drawing blood. Addison remained silent. He recollected the dozens of times over the past decades when he had a similar conversation with one of his students. "Why can't they see what I see?" Nigel asked. Addison got up, walked across the room, and poured another glass of water for Nigel. He returned to his seat and offered the glass to his friend. "Here, Nigel," Addison said, as he held the glass suspended before his friend. "Drink this." Nigel smiled, took the glass from Addison's hand, and drank pure, crystal-clear water. The water was so refreshing. Even though he had consumed quite a bit of it upon his arrival, it was a welcome feast for Nigel. "There is something fundamental that you have to understand, Nigel," Addison said, "and it is not an easy concept for any man to grasp. It will take time." Nigel put down the empty glass on the desktop and waited. "There is something about human nature," Addison began, "amongst the worst things in all of us, and it is present in this very situation we are discussing now." Nigel sat up. "What is it, Addison?" "There is a certain disposition in everyone that prevents them from learning something large in this world that does not have the sufficient prestige to make them important." Nigel was confused, and Addison saw that confusion writ large across his face. "I am a humble scientist," Addison continued, "and I have found the greatest joy studying the world around me all my life. Studying the nature of things makes for the greatest pride and humility that the world offers us. It is a beautiful oneness of these important opposites in life itself. When one gets to this state, the universe opens its mysteries. One can see things that other people simply cannot. It is not that they don't wish to see the largest things in life, but a narrowness in all of us prevents that from occurring." Nigel was more confused than ever and shuffled uncomfortably in his seat. "When I was a university student much like yourself, ever so many decades ago," Addison said wistfully, "I had, and still have, a curiosity about the world around me that was boundless. When I began my study of the nature of water, It was that curiosity and desire to see what is true about the whole world that led me to the discovery that changed my life, and will one day, I fervently hope, change the world. And it was that seeing by myself that made some people very, very angry. Why did that make people angry? Nigel asked. This large seeing I came to, Addison replied, questioned the superiority of those scientists who saw themselves as the authorities in the field of science. To them, it was a terrible affront and humiliation to their egos. It gave them a great pain that never had to be. Nigel sat there stunned by the words of his friend Addison Way. This disposition in all of us is profoundly present in the world of academia, Addison continued. What do you mean, Addison? Nigel replied, that these scientists do not wish to learn something large from someone who doesn't have the prestige to make them important. I do not understand. Think of it this way, Nigel, Addison continued. I was merely a young lad attending the university many years ago. If I were to come to a large seeing of something that is large and true about the world, and that no one had understood before me, what does that say about the so-called learned academics at the university? Why didn't they see what I saw? Is it possible that they would feel insulted and affronted by my comprehending something that they could not? It certainly didn't flatter their egos. Shouldn't they welcome this new knowledge if they are truly scientists? Nigel inquired. Yes, they should, Nigel, Addison replied. But they did not. Addison took a sip of his water and continued. New knowledge coming into the world has never been welcomed by the authorities of the day, and that was true for me too. In some ways, I was a young, naive university student. I expected my research into the nature of water to be welcomed with open arms by the faculty, but alas, I was so wrong. But after so many years, Addison, Nigel pressed, surely the passage of time and the state of mankind would force these experts to wholly acknowledge your work. As I look around me, I see humanity mired in ill health, and it is so obvious to me that the raw sewage water we have all consumed since childhood has had a grievous effect on all of our lives. Why can't everyone see something that is so obvious? Addison put down his glass and smiled. Nigel, how did you first react to the idea that the water you drank all your life was injurious to your very self? Did you welcome the fresh, pure water I offered you, or were you put off somehow by it? Nigel blushed and turned his head away in shame. You doubted me from the start, didn't you, Nigel? It was true. Nigel shifted uncomfortably in his seat and said nothing. The question is, why? Addison continued. Did you harbour such doubts when you first learned of my study of water? It makes no sense, Nigel finally replied sheepishly. Alas, Nigel, Addison exclaimed, but it does make sense. Does it? Nigel asked. Yes, indeed, Nigel, Addison explained. You see, you met new knowledge in the world. You had never met knowledge as large and true as what I presented in your young life. And what you had seen right from the beginning was not backed up by anyone else. There was no prestigious university acknowledging what I was teaching you. You didn't read about this in the press. None of your professors told you what they needed to learn from me. What you met was met with the stony silence of the past 40 years. How does a person make sense of all that? It is not easy, my friend. Nigel felt more confused than ever after this conversation with Addison. Indeed, those in positions of power should welcome knowledge that would so obviously have such a good effect on their lives. Why would someone reject such knowledge outright? As Nigel walked home that evening with a jug of Addison's purified water slung over his shoulder, he thought long and hard about how he could have Addison's work known to the world. Perhaps, Nigel thought, Addison is missing something here. Surely a presentation given soberly and with all the evidence available would convince people as to the efficacy of his work. As he trudged down the hill, Nigel remembered that his university was holding its annual science symposium next semester. they would invite science students from universities all over the kingdom to present papers on original, groundbreaking research for all of academia to see and evaluate. This could be the perfect forum for him to present Addison's research to the world of academia. When Nigel arrived home, it was late evening, and his parents had already gone to bed. He walked gently into the kitchen and placed his fresh water astride the jug he left there this morning. He was thirsty, and as he grasped the older jug, he was surprised to find it empty. Perhaps his parents had drunk the remaining water whilst he was away all afternoon. This was excellent news if it were so, and Nigel felt elated. If his parents could be persuaded to drink Addison's purified water, perhaps he could convince the science community of its value. After helping himself to a cup of water from the jug he had just carried down from the Highlands, Nigel went to bed and slept more soundly than he had in months.
So, Professor Umph brings in a professor from the University of London to basically cut Nigel off at the knees. And Nigel knew it. So, Nigel's trying to make sense out of something we're all trying to make sense out of. How does one meet large new knowledge come into the world? Would you just welcome it? Would I just welcome it? Well, Nigel has an idea about the symposium. And we'll find out more what happens in chapter 16. So for tonight, goodbye, good luck. We'll see you next time on the Great American Novel Series, brought to you by the Author's Matrix. I am Uriah Heep, and this is my Literary Cafe. Good night.